Welcome, everyone. We're so thrilled that Kerry Daynes is here. She's one of the most sought-after forensic psychologists in the business. She's come over to the island for the second time. She was here at the Isle of Wight Literary Festival just a few years ago. She's got 2 books. The new one, What Lies Buried, which is the reason that she's come back to tell us all about that, although we are going to dip into both of the books so that we get a full idea of her story. She tells aspects of her story throughout the books that sort of interweave through the very real stories of the people that we might call murderers, abusers, psychopaths, but she calls them clients. She writes with humour, with empathy, with compassion, and I'm so delighted that she's joined us today. Good afternoon.
Thank you. I'm so thrilled to be back. Thank you for having me again.
This is the first question I'm sure you're always asked. Why are we all so obsessed with crime? Such a big crowd of people here. This is the talk everyone wants to come to.
I don't know. Maybe you're just a really morbid bunch. I'm not sure. I think really, though, that we are, as human beings, programmed really to be interested in other human beings. And I think particularly when those other human beings might present a threat to us, you know, it's evolutionary advantage, isn't it, to pay attention and see what you can learn. So I think that people watch true crime to be both thrilled and anxious, but I think also to feel safer in some kind of way. I think that by watching true crime programs, reading about true crime in books, they feel more equipped and they think, oh, well, it won't possibly happen to me because I'll be able to spot them coming. I don't know that that's true, though.
You mentioned watching on the television. Is it like being a forensic psychologist on the TV, or is it a little bit different?
It's not remotely like being a forensic psychologist on the TV. So I hate to burst your bubble, but I don't get to trample all over crime scenes. I would be in big trouble if I did that. I get to see them in video and photographic form, and I certainly don't arrest people or wrestle with suspects. And I don't play mind games either. So I don't play, daring cat and mouse games with my clients, because that's a highway to nothing, really. So unfortunately, it's not like you see on TV. But I think that the real stories are just as interesting as what you see. And they're certainly more nuanced and challenging. So maybe they should do a crime drama about somebody that's more realistic.
How do you become a forensic psychologist? And I know this is a question you get asked by students, and you have a little private thought to yourself, don't you, if they haven't managed to work it out?
Well, I'm constantly being asked, how do you become a profiler? And actually, profilers, as a discrete job, that does not exist. Nobody's ever employed as a profiler. So I tell students that it's like the Hunger Games getting into forensic psychology, because it really is. There's so many hoops that you have to jump through, and it's very, very competitive. But when people ask me, young people ask me, how do I become a profiler? I think, well, if you've got this keen investigative mind, why haven't you at least figured out for yourself what the correct job title is? So when people say to me, how do I become a chartered forensic psychologist, then I think, there's hope for you.
Have you always been attracted to the macabre, the sort of the darkness? One of the books is called The Dark Side of the Mind. Has that always been something that you've been interested in?
Well, obviously that was my literary agent is a bit of a Pink Floyd fan, so that's how The Dark Side of the Mind came around as a title. But I have always been fascinated by, I suppose you could call it macabre, but yes, the darker side of things. And I think that that's because I'm a child of the 70s, and so I spent not my entire childhood, but a lot of my childhood in front of the television. That was kind of the babysitter, wasn't it, in the 70s? And I remember watching Tales of the Unexpected And actually, I still watch them. I still watch them because they're on Sky Arts, and I still really enjoy them. And I remember reading Roald Dahl and just being absolutely fascinated by a story of a landlady who was a serial killer and taxidermist. So, and yet I used to be absolutely terrified of anything with a monster in it. So I was behind the not just the cushions, but the sofa for Doctor Who. But yeah, I just enjoyed darker, twisty-turny stories.
I have to say the TV is still a babysitter now. The new book, What Lies Buried, I just want to read a little bit out because I think it gives a good idea of why you write. The people you're about to read of here, whether they are confessed killers, frightened and frightening hospital patients or victims, are all walking storybooks, just like the rest of us. Multi-layered characters with chapters already written, plot twists to navigate, and a narrative that is yet to reach its conclusion. My hope in writing about them is to give some compassion and humanity back to those who are often denied both. That's something that runs so thickly through both of the books that you've written, this compassion, these stories that you're so interested in as people.
It really is. And I think that the thing that I've taken from my career, which is now, over 30 years, is that what is missing from our criminal justice system and what is missing from our mental health system is compassion. And I know that makes me sound like, a soft lefty. But, I think that we're too focused on whether people are treated, in a soft way or a tough way. And actually, we don't look at what works. And what I have found is that what works is compassion. So I'm very much about trauma-informed approaches. And the vast, vast majority of the people that I've worked with, even those who have committed some absolutely horrendous offences, have been people that I've found something to like about. Not everybody. There's a few that, I've never quite found that redeeming factor, but by and large, they are, because of course they are human beings. They are multifaceted, they are layered, and they are products of the society that we all live in and we all help to create. So I think that if we don't see people as monsters, but we see them as people with some compassion, although obviously approach them rationally and realistically in terms of their risk, then we get much further.
I want to talk a little bit later about that kind of push-pull that you've just described.
Oh, it's a life of conflict, really. Being a forensic psychologist, you're constantly battling against your own emotional tide, really. There's ambiguities everywhere.
It feels like reading the books that every person that you've worked with, you learn something from. It makes you better at your job.
Well, every person that I write about, I have learned from. I can't say, I've worked with thousands of people now, and I don't necessarily learn something from all of them. And certainly when I sat down to write, I thought about who are the people that really stand out to me. Who are the people that I still think about all of those years later? And that's how I got the structure for my book, really.
So what happened with the writing? When did you make the decision? Had you always been percolating it in your mind that you would one day write? Or did you have to go back and look through all your notes and find these characters again?
I absolutely had no intentions of writing whatsoever. I type with one finger. I'm not a trained writer. And when you think about it, I've spent 30 years writing very dry, very academic, psychological reports in legalese language. So I wrote my first book because it was suggested to me. So, I thought, well, I'll give it a go. I don't know how this is really going to work out. And I didn't know where to start. So in the end, I thought I'll start with, I wrote down all of the questions that people ask me at parties when they find out that I'm a forensic psychologist. If they find out that you're a psychologist, usually people say, oh, are you reading my mind? I don't know why. And I always say, unless you're paying me £150 an hour, no, I'm not. Yeah. £150 an hour, by the way, that's a dream. So I thought about the questions that I was asked, and my books are based on that. So the first book is based on the question, what the hell is wrong with these people that you work with? And the second question that I'm always asked is, well, are they mad or are they bad? So that was my starting point, and I sat down at my dining room table, and my agent assured me that beautiful things happen and are created on dining room tables. And I thought about, as I say, who are the people that I still think about, who have shaped me as a person and as a psychologist. And then I just had a list of names, really, and each of those names became a chapter in a book.
You just mentioned the mad or bad question, and I think it's such an interesting theme that runs through the books. And I spoke before of this push-pull where you're being asked, is this person mad? Is this person bad? And that can have a huge impact on the sentence that they are then given for the crime that's been committed.
It's a massive, massive question, because it basically determines whether somebody is dealt with down the criminal justice route or whether they are sent to a hospital. And actually, what I've discovered is if they are sent to a hospital, they are much less likely to see the light of day for many, many years. So it's definitely not a soft option going to a secure hospital. But I liken it in my book to, it reminded me of the Charlie and the Chocolate Factory scenes, where Veruca Salt has been having some sort of screaming fit about something or other, and she goes in some sort of machine, and a lever is pushed, and they decide whether she's a good egg or a bad egg. Yeah. It's a similar kind of thing. And yet the question, more often than not, is really quite meaningless. Is somebody mad or bad? Usually they are a little bit of both, or maybe neither, or, sometimes leaning more heavily in one direction or the other. But yeah, the consequences that it has, really do weigh heavily on me. And as I say, I have to write my reports in legally accepted and psychiatric accepted language. And it is really frustrating at times. So one of the first stories that I told was...
Yeah, I wanted to ask about Michael. So he was a 17-year-old who'd murdered someone. And you were brought in to ask, he said he was hearing voices, and you gave your opinion, and then something different happened.
Yeah, so a 17-year-old boy who had murdered one person and had attempted to murder another person, so incredibly dangerous. And he told police that he was acting on paranoid delusional beliefs and voices telling him to kill. And he, if you took him at face value, he would require psychiatric treatment, medication, therapy, etc. But people who hear voices, people who suffer with severe mental health problems, who maybe are diagnosed with schizophrenia, aren't all dangerous. Usually you'll find that those who do commit violent offences have had a history of violence that predates their mental health episode. So he had a very interesting background, and he'd had trauma whilst serving in the army. I think he was 19 by the time I'd seen it. He'd gone into the army at 16. Yeah. But there was a big discussion, was he either a psychopath or he was somebody that was suffering from a mental health problem? And the answer was, truthfully, a little bit of both. And nobody wanted to hear that. And I remember the solicitor that I was working for, we had a big meeting and everybody looked at me, well, what side of the fence are you on? This is going to make a big difference to him. And, these are very, very serious offences. And there was that kind of feeling that the public wanted their pound of flesh.
Yeah.
So he'd done something that was so despicable that to say that he had a mental health problem would almost be to let him off the hook. And so they actually decided not to use my lovely nuanced psychological report at all. And they went with a psychiatrist who diagnosed him as a psychopath. And I met with Michael years later. I walked past a cell that he was in prison, and I noticed him because he was screaming to himself, and he had lots of scars from self-harm, and he just looked through me when I said hello to him. He didn't recognize me or remember me. And the prison officer who was escorting me on that occasion said, don't mind him. It's one of these schizos. He's hearing voices. He thinks that, the Taliban are after him. Hears voices telling him to harm himself and to kill people. And, it's such a feeling of sadness. Not only for him, and as I say, he had some psychopathic traits, so he wasn't necessarily the most likable character, but for the fact that he was not receiving the help that he needed, that ultimately would make him safer. So that's the frustrating part of my job, where you do the best job that you possibly can, and yet people just get trapped in a system that's not designed and created for them.
It feels like the criminal justice system, from the way you describe things, they want things to be very black and white.
Yes.
They want to know what is wrong with this person, what is their motivation, and they don't want the kind of nuanced answers that you give.
And I fully understand that, because I've been responsible for designing services. So, of course, you've got to design a service that's based around a particular set of people and a particular set of problems. But people don't fit into those nice, neat boxes very often. And of course, mental health provision in prisons is so needed and yet so woefully lacking. And it does have a direct bearing on how risky that person may be when they are released. So I think that as a system, should we not be trying to not be soft on people, not be, softy lefties, but understand the factors that contribute to their offending behaviour and address them so that we have less victims in the future. When I went into forensic psychology, it was with this lovely, very Miss World notion of I wanted to make the world a safer place. And I still have that, I'm still motivated by that.
One of the things I've really wanted to ask you about, because we all have this idea that serial killers are psychopaths, but a psychopath is a personality disorder. It's not a mental health issue. So how can you differentiate, I guess, between the two things? And then where do you say the blame is no blame? I find it so interesting.
I think when people commit dreadful offences like serial killers, people say, well, they've got to be sick in order to have wanted to do that. But then if you go with that argument, is every child abuser then sick? Do they all have some sort of mental disorder? No, they don't. They have highly problematic personality traits, but it's not a mental disorder as such. I've worked with several serial killers. And again, some of them have got mental health problems that they had predating their serial killing. Some of them have mental health problems that they gained whilst serial killing, really, because of the trauma, that's involved in that. to themselves, not least, their victims. So, but this is it. People just don't fit into these beautiful boxes. And if you are a psychopath, you are just as likely, if not more likely, to be a CEO of an organization, a political leader, work with the police. And as we're in a church, some research has said that psychopathy is quite prevalent in members of the clergy. So it doesn't necessarily follow that if you have psychopathic traits that you are then going to be, killing people in hideous ways and have bodies stashed under your floorboards. But I think that these, misunderstandings are passed down really via TV dramas, via crime documentaries, so via the stories that we tell. So I think that the least that my stories should do is try and counteract the myths and the misunderstandings out there.
Tell us about Frank, because he wanted to be a serial killer, but he didn't like blood.
Yeah. God love Frank. When I met Frank, he was wearing a John Wayne Gacy T-shirt. And I thought, who makes John Wayne Gacy T-shirts? Never mind wears them. And he was, he'd been taken to a place of safety by the police because somebody in his local area had been found very, very badly beaten. He did survive, but by the grace of God, really. And Frank had immediately been in the frame for this offence because he was known as the local strange guy and weirdo. And he did actually make a full and frank confession. See what I did there? So he'd made a confession to this offence, and he'd got really quite distressed whilst being questioned by the police, and he'd started hitting his head against the wall, and so they decided that Frank was far too weird for them to deal with, and he'd been taken to a hospital where I'd been asked to assess him. And I don't want to tell you all of the story because, of course, I want you to read it and discover for yourself whether Frank was actually responsible for this violence. But we were doing some standard psychological assessments, which he hadn't performed very, very well on, until we came to the maths questions. And he was far better at maths than I was, for sure. He was lightning quick when it came to the maths questions. But not only did he give me the answer to the maths questions that I was asking him about. If you're wondering why a psychologist would ask maths questions, by the way, it's part and parcel of an overall IQ test. And I wanted to get an understanding, a profile, if you like, of his cognitive skills and abilities. But for every number that he gave me as an answer, he gave me a handy serial killer fact to go with it. So, if, for example, if the answer was 16, he'd say, well, such a body had 16 victims. Or if the answer was 23, he would say, well, such a body was sent to the was executed in America on the 23rd, blah, blah, blah. So he had all of these serial killer facts. He was like a Wikipedia. It was amazing, really. And it was very, very interesting. And I was thinking, I think I'm getting a bit of a measure of what's going on here with Frank. But also what was very telling, and you can't put this into a psychological assessment, but as we were coming out of the psychological assessment, another patient who was on the same ward as Frank, who was a young girl, approached me, and she'd cut her wrist, and I literally just got covered in this jet of blood, and just instinctively I grabbed hold of her wrist to stop it from bleeding, and there was this very, very unseemly kind of push and pull, and then other staff got involved. And anyway, it ended up with me on the floor with, a male nurse on top of me, which was a nice introduction, and obviously there was blood all over the place. And by the time all of this had unfolded, and I was just processing what had happened on the floor, I looked over to see Frank kind of huddled in a corner like this, and he'd gone white. And I went over to him, "Are you okay? Are you okay?" And he said to me, "I'm scared of blood. I'm terrified of blood." And I'm thinking, just a minute, you're an aspiring serial killer, so you've been telling me, who has committed this very, very, bloody, gory offence, and yet you're frightened of blood. There's something here that's not quite adding up. So as I said, I don't want to give too much away, but Frank was on the autistic spectrum, as you might have noticed, and a very interesting and incredibly unexpected story unfolded, which explained precisely why he had made this confession. And as I say, it was so left field that I can't begin to tell you, but you will have to read my book to find out what that was.
The story you just told about the girl who'd cut her wrist and you've got blood all over you makes me think of how much of your books are set in prisons, rehabilitation centres, mental health hospitals, some quite dangerous places that you've been based in through your career.
Not necessarily dangerous places, I wouldn't say, but you do get covered in various bodily fluids at certain times. So, yes, people do think that they are dangerous environments, and I suppose they are compared to other environments, although I would hate to be a nurse working in A&E or be a paramedic, because I think that's far more dangerous. And by and large, I know exactly who I'm working with, and I know what they've done. And if I'm doing my job correctly, I've built some sort of relationship with them whereby I would understand if they were likely to attack me, and hopefully they wouldn't attack me because we've built that relationship. But I would be able to see the risks beforehand. That's a lot of what psychologists do. It's all about not quite gazing into a crystal ball, but predicting violence and predicting risky behaviours.
At the beginning of your career, you spent quite a lot of time in prisons and had, I think, some pretty important learning experiences out of it.
Oh, yes.
I actually just wanted to ask you, slightly left field question, have you spent any time in Parkhurst prison on the island?
No, I haven't, although I was reading your, well, not your exactly, but your island prisons inspectorate report recently.
How is it?
It's improving. It's improving. Like every prison, it's not quite fit for purpose, I have to say. And I really do feel for the governor there, but they are doing a great deal of work to try and improve on things, which of course is being thwarted by low staffing levels. So, it's pretty similar to what's happening across the board, really. And I always like to keep an eye on what's happening across the board.
You've had to develop a pretty tough interior, exterior. I think people are often surprised that there is a woman like you, the top forensic psychologist. But actually, I couldn't believe reading 73% of forensic psychologists are women.
Yeah, over 80%. Yeah. 84%, I think it was, at the time I wrote my first book. It might be even higher than that at the moment.
And why is that?
I think because women are more interested in psychology because we are socialized to be interested more in our fellow man than maybe in, objects and machinery. And I do think that is, it's a stereotype, isn't it? But we are socialized into that stereotype. And I think that it's, it's so strange. Well, first of all, it's so strange that nobody realizes that there are so many women in forensic psychology, and actually so many women in forensic science as well. So, all of the blood spatter analysis type people that I know, and a lot of the forensic pathologists that I know are women. And the first thing that people do when they see me and I say what I am is they kind of look at me and go, "Oh, but you're," and they don't quite know how to say it in a politically correct way, so they just go. So it means, "Oh, I'm a woman. Yes, thank you very much for noticing." And I think that's because certainly, I don't think quite so much now, but certainly in previous years, most of the forensic psychology experts that you would see on TV were men. And of course, we had Robbie Coltrane, didn't we, as Cracker. And I don't know, I wanted to go to the talk on the authority gap. I don't know whether any of you went to that before you came here, but unfortunately I had to, well, not unfortunately, but I had to be here for my sound check. But I've bought the book, so that's good. But people just think that it's a man thing, and you've got to be rough and tough somehow, and obviously, that requires a man.
Well, not once they've met you. I think you definitely changed that perspective, that perception. I wanted to ask you about violent crime against women, because you have to soak a lot of that up.
And can I say, we actually need more men in forensic psychology, because in forensic psychology, as in the entire sector of violence against women and girls, it's an army of women who are fighting, to combat this problem, and it's a male problem. So we need more men involved to address men. Having women addressing men about issues of masculinity is okay, but it's not ideal, is it?
There's a lot of other things that come with your job that are tricky. I'm just thinking of online abuse. You've had a stalker. You've had your own experience of an abusive relationship. All of this stuff in your personal story that must weave into the way you do your job now.
Yes, so I did have an abusive relationship when I was 22. So that was a baptism of fire, really. But at that time, I was working at Wakefield Prison, maximum security prison, the biggest one in Western Europe. And you would think at the age of 22 that my biggest problem would be kind of navigating the prison environment and the high number of sex offenders that Wakefield Prison houses. But actually, the far greater problem was working with prison officers and dealing with the misogyny that was just weaved into the place at the time. I do hope that things have changed. The senior officer on C Wing, where I worked, was later arrested and convicted of 5 rapes and abduction of several young, 12-year-old girls and their sexual assault. So that's a senior officer on C Wing. So it certainly showed me that, the fact that one might be in a prison uniform and the other might be in a prison officer uniform doesn't actually give you as much information as you might think it does. But I think that, of course, that shapes you and creates you. And in a way, I'm grateful for those experiences. I wouldn't actually change anything. So
it was when you met Alison, though, and this is in the first book, when you met Alison and you started looking at the coercive control, you found that quite difficult, didn't you?
Well, the first ever time I was asked to assess somebody in a case of homicide, which is quite a big moment for a forensic psychologist. So you're being trusted as a court-appointed expert witness, and with, an offence as serious as homicide. And I always thought that this client that I'd been, envisaging and waiting for would be a man. And actually, it turned out to be a woman who had killed her abusive partner. She'd killed him, and she struggled with obsessive-compulsive traits. And she used to, when she was anxious, she used to obsessively clean. And so she'd actually tried to clean him up, but not in a very effective manner. She'd tried to chop him up with a Black & Decker saw. Yeah. And then finding that she wasn't capable of this, she'd actually just laid down beside him and waited to be found. She was a first for many reasons. She was the first of my clients to ever vomit on my shoe. But hearing her story and the physical abuse and also coercive control that she'd been through was really quite something. And of course, I always go and do my background checks, and I'd spoken to the police, and the police had gone and interviewed the exes of the man that she'd killed. And of course, you know, we don't go looking for information about the bad character of somebody who is the victim of a violent crime. That is not, you know, that's not something that we would routinely do. We have to have a good reason to do that. But the testimony of his exes really was very useful, and of course backed up what she was telling me. And what I was very conscious of is that I can't let my own emotions, I can't let my own bias and prejudices, and of course I have bias and prejudices, like everybody does. I can't allow them to get in the way of my report writing. And so what I try to do for every case, but some cases you need to do it more than others, is I always take that moment to actually sit back, have a cup of tea and a hobnob with myself and think, right, actually, how do I feel about this? You know, am I blazingly angry with this person? Do I feel sorry for this person? Because neither of those things are constructive. So just, you know, think about what of my own stuff I'm bringing into that story. So the old Freudian transference and projection, all of that kind of thing. So of course I had to sit and think about my own experiences, and it made logical sense to put my own experiences hand in hand with her story within that chapter.
And I know you've talked before about how you are constantly having therapy as well, which I found really interesting to be able to deal with everything. A very quick thought from me. Do you remember when the Archers, the radio show,
The Archers, yes,
did the story about Helen and Rob? I found that story really reminded me of it. I just wondered whether that had had any impact. I thought it's just so interesting.
I've never listened to The Archers. I'm sorry.
Who in the audience remembers that story? If you're, yeah. So I would say that if you want to find out maybe what had inspired that storyline, then there is a story in Kerry's book that will really remind you of it. So
Really?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well,
absolutely.
there you go. I didn't know. And I can't listen to The Archers now because I'm deaf.
No.
So.
There must be a way that you can. We were talking about this earlier, weren't we? About podcasts. If you're deaf, it's something that's so difficult to access.
Right.
On that note, your health. We were talking about, you know, the toll that this job takes, and you have found it very stressful at times, and that has impacted your health quite considerably.
Yes, I would say so. So I developed Meniere's disease when I was 22, and I absolutely believe that it was something to do with this relationship. And, you know, it's affected my hearing. I don't know whether you know what Meniere's disease is, but it affects your inner ear and your vestibular system. So if you suffer from Meniere's disease, you have tinnitus, and then you have periods of dizziness where it's literally like you're on a fairground ride and you can't get off. And I tend to, you know, overheat, you know, vomit. It's not pleasant, but also just strange things to do with your balance function. So I've found that if I walk the way that I'm not used to down a supermarket aisle, it messes with the messages in my brain and I fall over. So I remember having my first really major Meniere's attack in public, which was on a platform at Sheffield Station, and everybody just thought that I was drunk, basically. So walked around me while I lay on the floor, spinning. It is like the worst ever, alcohol-induced, I don't know what you call them, whiteout that you've ever encountered. But they do say that Meniere's disease can be triggered by stress and trauma. And I think that an awful lot of things that I've pushed down, I call it pushing the eyeball to the side of the soup, but you have to read the book to understand that reference as well. I think, as I always say, if you don't tell your story will tell you, either in the way that you behave, or I think for me, just in my body. The body tells the story, doesn't it? And the body holds your trauma. So whenever I get really stressed and anxious, and I do get really stressed and anxious, I haven't got all of the answers as a psychologist, then I start to get tinnitus and I start to feel dizzy, and I have now lost my hearing. And it's so annoying because it comes at the times when you least need it, really.
And you told me earlier that that's actually meant you've had a bit of not a career change, but the last couple of years you're shifting your career. I just want to know what's next for you.
Well, I had to think about it, because obviously if I can't hear very well, then if I assess a client and I mishear what they say, that could mean an extra 10 years added onto that client's, prison sentence. And I don't want to lower the tone, but I did assess a sex offender who was telling me that he was into extreme fishing. I know, and I didn't quite hear it correctly, and he was a very deviant sex offender. So you can imagine, or maybe you can't, and I'm not going to explain how that, how I needed to clarify that. Because I do talk about very base things with my clients, I'm afraid. It's part and parcel. You can't know any shame or embarrassment as a forensic psychologist. So, yeah, I've had a little bit of an about turn. I still do. I pick and choose now. I still do my assessments, but I take longer to do them, and I just try and make sure that I can definitely hear what people are saying to me, and I'd certainly double-check everything that is said to me. But I've been very, very lucky that I've been able to have a second career, if you like, in media and writing books, which I'm now getting a little bit into. So
you must have another book in you. There must be more stories that you have to tell in another book.
There are more stories. I'd really like to take a foray into writing crime novels. Ooh. I don't think that I'm going to be writing cozy crime, because there's really nothing very cozy about any of the crimes that I've dealt with. And if I write something, I want it to have a purpose. I want it to have a meaning and a message, and I want it to inform people. So I'd like to write crime novels that are based on real life cases, but that actually highlight where we sometimes go wrong, or miscarriages of justice, or just, mistakes that get made and get made over and over again. So I think, I'm still a social justice warrior. I think I will always be that.
Kerry, I could go on talking to you forever, but I know that other people are going to have questions. I just want you to promise me that when you write your first crime novel, you'll come back here to the Isle of Wight Literary Festival and tell us all about it.
I absolutely will, yes, thank you.
I'm going to open it up to questions now. Just because of Kerry's hearing, what we're going to do is we'll try and get a microphone to you. If you ask the question, I'm then going to tell Kerry what the question is. So it should be all right. We'll give it a go, won't we?
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I know that slows us down a bit.
Who's first? Oh, we've got someone here.
I just wanted to ask, last week or the week before, the national news ran a story of two 12-year-old boys who attacked and killed a man with a machete. And I have conscious bias, I think. My thoughts is that the number of very violent video games that are being played by people of all ages, all sexes, and I wonder, with your profession or worldwide, has there been research done looking at the desensitization that can occur? And is there any evidence that the use of these games has led to an increase in violent crime?
I did actually catch that. I saw that. Thank you, because I'm right in your eye line there, so I was able to lip read. There has been lots of research into violent video games and also violent cartoons and what we would call video nasties, although I think that shows our age if we use that term. And actually, there's no conclusive evidence that it impacts upon violent crime. I think that certainly we have seen the statistics show us that we've seen a rise in knife crime, or what they call bladed article crime. So a machete would also be included in those statistics recently. And a great deal of that rise is to do with under 18-year-olds. And I think that there are various factors which are at play. And one of the factors I think that is at play is social media. Social media, if you are a young boy, you don't have to be on TikTok for very long before the algorithm will show you content involving knife crime. And it will also show you adverts for knives. So zombie knives and butterfly knives apparently are very popular at the moment with young men. And I think that there's an element of social contagion. It only takes, one or two in a classroom or a group, a social group, to start carrying these knives, and it's seen as the cool thing to do. There are various genres of music, rap, grime. There's another one which I can't remember the name of. I call it dirt, but I think that's wrong. I think I'm getting that mixed up with grime. There are various, musical crazes at the moment that are popular with these kids, that show people in balaclavas and, bragging about violent knife crime. So they are influenced by this. And I think that a lot of kids feel pressure to carry knives, or they think, well, if other people are carrying knives, I need a knife in order to protect myself. And so we have to get the message out there to them that A, it's not cool, but B, if you carry a knife, you are far more likely to actually be the victim of knife crime yourself. Not to mention the fact that if you do use that knife, that split-second decision to do something incredibly stupid can take somebody's life, and it's going to absolutely obliterate yours when you're standing in front of a youth court. So it is a real worry. It really is. At the moment. And it's not just kids that are from bad or deprived backgrounds that are using knives. It's kids from all backgrounds. So I think we need to, I think that TikTok and social media need to start taking responsibility for the content that they show kids. Definitely, that's a big thing. And we haven't at all addressed it properly within the Internet Harms Bill that's recently come out. Yeah. But it's a cultural thing, I think.
As a mother of young children, young boys, it's something I worry about. They're not big enough yet, but I'm hoping that we might have got a bit more of a handle on it by the time they're a little bit older.
I'm so glad I did not grow up with social media. Yeah, I really am.
Me too.
Yeah.
We've got another question. I think the microphone's already there, and don't make it too long so that I can pray see it back.
You talked about the fact that your book features the clients that you particularly remember, and my question is, what is stands out about these clients versus all the others?
So you talk about in your book the clients you really remember. What is it about them, the specific characters that stand out for you?
Some of them are just fantastic, fantastic characters that you can't possibly forget. So one thing that I'm very, very proud of about my book is that not every chapter involves a serial killer or somebody who has committed some horrible, violent, nasty, gory crime. We don't, that's not a necessity for crime to be interesting and readable. So there's one chapter which is about a shoplifter, and you'd think, gosh, this is so dull, isn't it? Who's going to read about a shoplifter? But Clifford, not Cliff, as he introduced himself to me, was just such a corker of a character. And he had a list of shoplifting offences as long as both of your arms. And he was somebody that would go into his local Boots or wherever, wearing his special adapted shoplifting trousers. So he had these trousers that were big baggy trousers, and the pockets had been cut out of the insides. I've also met sex offenders with the same kind of trousers. Yeah. And he had bits of rope around the ankles of his trousers, so his boots would lace up around his ankles. And he would steal just the most ridiculous things. So I think it was like 17 extendable umbrellas on one occasion. And he shoplifted a job lot of clocks. So can you imagine? He's walking like this, ticking like the crocodile out of Peter Pan. And oddly enough, he would often be picked up.
Yeah.
So, but his defense was always that he had memory difficulties and he'd simply forgotten to pay for these items. Yeah. And the thing is, he would get off with it over and over and over again. He had a longer list of offences that he'd not been convicted of, yeah, which was just amazing. Now, it did turn out that he did have some very genuine memory difficulties, which put me in a difficult position. And it just shows you that you can write a really very intelligent report, and then a court will look at the last 2 lines of it, or reduce it to headlines. Oh, he's got memory difficulties. All right, let's let him off. And my report would say he's got memory difficulties, as outlined in the main body of my report, that make absolutely, no difference and have no relevance to his offending behaviour whatsoever. But still. And so he was just such a great character. You really have to read about Clifford, not Cliff, to understand. And his story was so sad. I think it's sad cases that stick out for me. Or it is, I don't want to be overly, I don't overdo the pathos, but it's people that have been dealt a really bad lot in life.
You champion the underdog, I think.
Again, I think that's that social justice warrior thing about me.
All right, let's get another question. There's a gentleman at the back.
Yes. I'd like to ask you a question about the recent case in Nottingham where the 2 students were stabbed to death, and how the victims' parents and families apparently were so upset about the verdict that was given on the perpetrator. So my question is, as a forensic psychologist, do you have to blank out the feelings of a victim's family, or is it part of the whole process you go through?
Do I have to think about the victim's
family?
family?
So he was just referencing the case in Nottingham with the 2 students, and then that the parents, the families were so upset with the verdict. Do you have to sort of blank all that out?
I know it is very difficult, but in my work as a forensic psychologist, I cannot, I can't really think about. Again, that's one of the things that I do, during my cup of tea and hobnob with myself is think about how I feel about the victims. Because if I let that encroach onto my assessment, then my assessment would be biased. And sometimes victims' families are very, very upset with verdicts. You know, particularly if they see that somebody's being treated as they would see it, you know, softly. And I suppose the classic example of that was with I hate to call him the Yorkshire Ripper because I hate these stupid media monikers, but Peter Sutcliffe. People didn't want to accept that he actually had a psychotic mental illness that had contributed to, not caused, his offending behaviour. They wanted him to go to prison and serve his time. They didn't want him to go to Broadmoor because they saw that as a softer option. Well, if you've ever spent any time, you know, at Casa Broadmoor, I can tell you that it's not a softer option. Yeah, you know, and I remember actually, I didn't put this in the book, but the case that we were talking about before of the woman who had killed her abusive partner. I'm not going to tell you what happens at the end, but I was there in court to, not for the verdict, but to hear her sentencing, as were the family of her, you know, the partner that she'd killed. And as I walked out, the mother attempted to spit at me, but missed. And I feel for them because their loved one has died in a way that nobody should die. They've had their life taken from them. So I wouldn't, you know, I wouldn't even try to argue with that or rationalize that with somebody, but it's not something that I can think about. Now that I do less what I call proper forensic work, and I now work with campaign groups and I work in the media, then I do spend more time with victims and victims' families. So, for example, some of the documentaries that I've been involved with have highlighted failures on the part of police, times when things were, you know, so predictably going to go awry and nothing happened. And we've been able to use those documentaries to campaign or, you know, force an inquiry. So the odd victim's family have had an apology, or there's been some change in practice as a result. And that's a different kind of good feeling. But as a forensic psychologist, you work in lots of different types of roles, and I just have to be very mindful of actually what is this job that I'm doing, and what will this job allow me to do and feel in terms of empathy.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap it up there. I could carry on talking to you, as I said, for many, many hours. I just want to read out a sentence just that really struck me reading the book. Perhaps if we listen more and judge less, then we'll see that there may be a little bit of their story in all of us. And I think we've all got a really good flavour this afternoon of what you're about, that compassion, that empathy, and that humour as well. So yeah, thank you absolutely. So much, Kerry.
Thank you so much, and thank you for coming.
Thank you.